Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Biggs-Craft, and I'm the Executive Director and Curator of the St. John Jewish Historical Museum in St. John, New Brunswick. I would like to welcome you here this afternoon for the first installment in our lecture series, Travels to Israel. In order to make this presentation enjoyable for all participants, I would ask that all of you mute your microphones, which I think you have done. If you haven't, you can just click on the image of the microphone that you can see at the bottom left of your screen. For the best viewing and to see the images which Cassie will be sharing, you can adjust how you see this event by clicking on the word view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and choosing speaker view. If you wish to make a comment or if you have a question for Cassie, which we'll move to it after the presentation, you are encouraged to do that, but we would prefer if you use the chat button, which you can find at the bottom center of your screen. You can just type in your comment or question, and I will share these with Cassie and with everyone else after the presentation. This lecture is being recorded, and it will be shared at a later date on our St. John Jewish Historical Museum YouTube channel, and a link to that page will be sent to you once it is available. This lecture is part of our new museum exhibit, The View from Damascus Gate, Travels to Israel, 1855 to 2018. This exhibition has been 2 years in the making, from the initial meeting in August 2019 with Cassie Stanley, who introduced us to the photographs taken in the Holy Land by her great-great-grandfather, Reverend William Mead Jones, and the process of building an exhibit up to this moment. In addition to these photographs, we have artifacts that the Jones family brought back with them. And to connect this story to St. John, the exhibit includes stories of travels collected from our museum members and friends. And we extend our thanks to all of those who have shared these stories. Each one represents a different and unique perspective. Funding for the creation of the exhibition was provided by the Exhibition Renewal and Museum Activities Support Program through the Archaeology and Heritage Branch of the province of New Brunswick. And funding for the lecture series was provided by the Greater St. John Community Foundation. Without their support, none of this would have been possible. Thank you. This afternoon's presenter is Cassie Stanley. Cassie Stanley is the great-great-granddaughter of Reverend William Mead Jones, and she will be sharing the fascinating story of life in the early days of missionary activity in the Holy Land. She is a graduate of the University of New Brunswick and resides in the St. John area. She also noted that she wanted to thank her two sisters, and I think they might be with us here today, for giving her the Jones family papers when they were dividing up their mother's apartment almost 20 years ago. The story that Cassie is about to share with us is a fascinating one. I'm going to turn this over to Cassie and let you go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me. I'm here to share with you what life was like for an American missionary family in Jerusalem in the 1850s. Catherine Biggs-Craft, director and curator of the St. John Jewish Historical Museum, has worked on a very exciting exhibit about Jerusalem and has included my great-great-grandfather's photographs he took in the Holy Land in the 1850s, a couple of which I'll show you here today. Parts of his story we have gleaned from his journals and correspondence and mementos brought back from the Holy Land that have been handed down and saved through 4 generations of our family. I'd like to thank Catherine, along with Laurie Cohen-Hackett, president of the board, whom I first approached with an idea of sharing these photographs with the museum, and also the board of the museum for giving me this opportunity to share this story with you. Thank you also to Reverend Nicholas Kirsten and Janet Thorngate of the Seventh-day Baptist General Conference in Wisconsin for their help in my research and lending us the clothes brought back from the Holy Land by William and his daughter Miriam Jones that had been donated to the church by our family but which are now on display at the museum as part of the exhibit for you to see. Actually, you can see them right behind Catherine, where she is sitting. Thank you also to the translators who helped me with some of the French, Arabic, Italian, and German correspondence. And finally, Jorgen Clausen of St. John, who first told me that I had something special when I showed him Jones's photographs of Jerusalem taken in the 1850s. William Mead Jones and his wife Elizabeth were missionaries from New York State who, on March 11, 1854, along with their young daughter, Martha Miriam, set sail from Boston for the Holy Land under the direction of the Seventh-day Baptist Missionary Society of New York. This excerpt, taken from the 1892 Jubilee Papers, historical papers commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Seventh-day Baptist Missionary Society, explains their mission. I quote, "In 1853, the Board of the Missionary Society of the Seventh-day Baptists resolved that measures be taken to establish a mission in Palestine. The board appointed Reverend William M. Jones as missionary of the board to Palestine. It was thought best that the mission in Palestine should have an industrial or agricultural department that, by giving employment to poor Arabs and Jews, that could be brought more directly under Christian influences and instruction. And Mr. and Mrs. Charles Saunders were chosen to take charge of this department, and Mr. Jones should devote himself wholly to the missionary labor." The Jones and Saunders families arrived in Jaffa today, which is part of Tel Aviv, the seaport of the Holy Land, on May 18, 1854, about 2 months after leaving Boston. Jones was 36 years old. His wife Elizabeth was 34, and young Martha Miriam, my great-grandmother, was only 9. The Joneses spent 2 years in Jaffa with a small group of fellow American missionaries who were developing an agricultural colony called Mount Hope. In the spring of 1856, the Jones family left this group and moved to Jerusalem to set up a faith mission there. They lived in Jerusalem for 4 years until their departure at the end of 1860. For much of their stay, Jones kept daily journals, which he saved, along with his correspondence, some account books of Elizabeth, drawing booklets and journals of Miriam's, and other miscellaneous mementos. I have here to show you, this is an account book that Elizabeth used in 1860. And just to show you how simple it is, just very simple, money coming in, which wasn't very much, and money going out. This is his first journal that he used. You can see all my stickies from research on the sides. And to show you the inside, this is the type of writing that he had. Sometimes easy to read and sometimes not. This is a treasure trove that has been handed down to us, along with 24 original photographs he took and developed during his stay in Jerusalem. Copies of these photographs are on display at the museum, and so I hope many of you will have an opportunity to see them. It is from these sources we find out the purpose of the mission, their daily life, work, illnesses and deaths, their trips in and around Jerusalem, the names of other foreigners from the United States, Great Britain, and Europe who were living in or visiting the Holy Land during the 1850s, historical events during this period, and of course, his efforts in the relatively new world of photography. I will fast forward before painting a picture of their life in Jerusalem and tell you that they had a child born in 1857, Annie Lizzie, who died at 2 years old of malaria. Also, Elizabeth, Jones's wife and mother to Martha Miriam, died a year and a half after her daughter at age 40. Both she and Annie Lizzie were buried together in the American Cemetery on the summit of Mount Zion by the Tomb of David outside the old walls. And Jones took a photograph of this cemetery. In the background is the tomb of David. Within the stone wall is the American cemetery, and there's a single olive tree in the cemetery that he mentions in a letter. And outside, I understand there are other burials, but I'm not sure who it is or who was buried there. Close to 40 years after they left in 1897, this property on the summit of Mount Zion was sold to Catholic monks, and the Church of the Dormition was built and stands there today. All of the remains of the old American cemetery were moved to the Jerusalem Protestant Cemetery, also known as the English Cemetery. It's located behind the gardens of what was then the Bishop Gobat School, now the Jerusalem University College. The new headstone inserted in the stone wall of this cemetery is still clear today, as both my cousin Bob Cruikshank and the past minister of St. Paul's Anglican Church, Rosse, Albert Snellgrove, along with his wife Wandlin and a friend Pam Ipe, recently visited this cemetery on their trips to Jerusalem. And once they found the caretaker with the key to let them in, took pictures of this lovely place where my family lie today. And I have a couple of photographs just to show you. This is inside the cemetery. These are the gates. So outside must be the gardens behind what was just Bishop Gobat School. Within this wrought iron fence here are the remains that came from the Mount Zion American Cemetery. And in the wall back there is the stone that I will show you. This stone. I don't know who the bottom person is. The next up is Elizabeth P. Jones, my great-great-grandmother. Above her is Annie Lizzie Jones, the 2-year-old young child. Above her is a little girl called Rebecca Dennis, who I will talk about later on in this talk. What was Jerusalem like in the 1850s? At this time, the Holy Land was part of the large Ottoman Empire. The land was governed by a series of Arab officials answerable to a central government in Constantinople. Jones refers to Pasha, who was the official during this time. By the mid-19th century, major foreign countries, including the United States, had established consular offices in Jerusalem. The American consul during most of their time in Jerusalem was John Warren Gorham, though Jones dealt with many of the other foreign consuls also. The city of Jerusalem is more than 5,000 years old. It is a walled city with the site of the first and second temple at its highest point. Since medieval times, the old city has been divided into Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and Armenian quarters. It is reached through gates in the walls, including the Jaffa Gate, Damascus Gate, and Lions Gate. And I have two photographs here. This is the Damascus Gate that Jones took the picture of. There's the entrance to the old city there. And this photograph was taken from inside the walls, looking out of Damascus Gate. Evening walks for the Joneses were often out one gate and returning through another. The old city within the walls is only 1 square kilometer in area. Therefore, the buildings were crowded together, but provided space for worship, education, markets, and living quarters for members of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths. And there's another photograph. This photograph was Jones took from the roof of his house on Accra, but it's just to show you how crowded everything is and a little bit what the architecture looked like and all the flat roofs. It wasn't safe to live outside the walls because of Bedouin marauding. The city couldn't expand beyond the walls until there was much more security along the roads, which didn't begin to happen until the 1860s after they left. To give you an idea of the state of life within the walls for the Joneses, in 1863, 3 years after they left Jerusalem, a special firman created a municipal council. Changes after the Jones left included installing a sewage system, regular garbage collection, kerosene lamps put up to light the city at night, and during certain times of the year, the streets were sprinkled with water to keep down the dust. This means that while the Jones family were living there, these things did not exist, reflected in the hardships of their life and causing many of their illnesses and security problems. For them, if they went out at night, they had to take a light to guide their way, also a servant for security. On some occasions in his journal, if they were visiting another family for an evening, they would spend the night rather than walk the streets to go home. The gates around Jerusalem were locked from sundown to sunrise. If an emergency occurred, or if they were traveling and arrived back late, it took a while to get someone to come to get permission to unlock the gate to let you in and out of the city. The mail and travelers were often robbed along the routes outside the walls. From mid-1850s, the expansion of Jerusalem outside the old city began and was witnessed by the Joneses, with institutions being built, including the Russian compound, Karim Avraham, a 20-minute walk from the city, established by James Finn, the British consul, the Schneller Orphanage, Bishop Gobat School, and Mishkanot Shananim, which was the housing development built and paid for by Sir Moses Montefiore and Judah Thoreau, British and American philanthropists. William Jones's journals contain reference in passing of each of these developments or the people involved with them. He described in detail observing the building of the Russian compound outside the walls. They were invited to the British consul's Karim Avraham for tea. He described meeting on one of his evening walks Johann Schneller and a German friend of his after they were robbed of some of their clothing and their watches on the way to Schneller's new home outside the walls that would become the Schneller Orphanage. This orphanage grew into one of the largest Protestant educational facilities in the Middle East. It's now luxury apartments. Miriam attends Bishop Gobat's school, and it is behind this school that Elizabeth and Annie Lizzie are buried today. Bishop Gobat was the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem from 1846 until his death in 1879. Jones has interaction over the years with Sir Moses Montefiore, his assistant, Dr. Hodgkin, and the American philanthropist Judah Thoreau's representative, Gershom Kershid. The Joneses were there when Jerusalem started expanding, necessary to accommodate its growth in the 20th century. Someone in my research described this period as the city breaking out of its walls. About their travels. In the 1850s, travel through the country depended on caravans of horses, camels, and donkeys across unmarked tracks. Anyone who traveled relied on local guides or soldiers to protect them from a variety of natural and human hazards. Again, his journals describes travels under these conditions. He mentioned in his journal while traveling that there are no roads, just paths from the towns. When they traveled alone, especially after the two 1858 affairs I described below, they would pay to have a soldier with them as a guard. In January of 1858, fellow American missionary friends in Jaffa, Walter and Sarah Dixon, whose two daughters, Mary and Elmira, married two Steinbeck brothers, Frederick and John, had been robbed and attacked at their American mission farm colony, Mount Hope. Frederick was shot and killed. His wife, Mary, his mother-in-law and father-in-law were attacked and beaten. This is known as the Jaffa outrage and caused quite an international state of affairs. John Steinbeck was in Jerusalem at the time, and it was Jones who had to tell him what had happened, accompany him back to Mount Hope, bury Frederick, and support and aid the families during the aftermath. We have in the exhibit at the museum a beautiful olive wood vanity box made by John Steinbeck and given to Elizabeth Jones just before the Dixon Steinbeck family left in June of that year to go back to the United States. It is inscribed with kind regards, which from saved correspondence and journal excerpts shows it was given in appreciation for all the family's support and friendship during trying times. I have a photograph of this box. This is the olive wood box with the inscription on top. This is the inscription to Mrs. E.P. Jones, kind regards, Jerusalem, May 14th, 1858. And this is a picture of the inside of the box. You can see that there used to be a mirror on the top part that is broken, but on the piece of paper behind the mirror, written in pencil, it says wood lining from River Jordan. I'm presuming that John Steinbeck wrote that, as there had been a mirror on top of it when he made it. When the Dixons and John Steinbeck left the Holy Land, that was the end of the American Agricultural Mission Settlement, Mount Hope. As an interesting side, this John and Elmira Dixon Steinbeck relocated to California and are the grandparents of the American author John Steinbeck. In September of 1858, their friend in Jerusalem, Miss Matilda Creasy, one of the first female English missionaries to live long-term in Jerusalem, was killed after being beaten and robbed as she walked outside the walls on her way to the British consul's home, Karim Avraham, that I mentioned before. Her body was not found for a couple of days. Especially after 1858, foreigners in the Holy Land were becoming very afraid for their safety and security. Jones's purpose in Jerusalem was to set up a Seventh-day Baptist mission, which he did not accomplish fully. He had Sabbath day or Saturday meetings in his house, which were often attended to by other foreigners living or visiting Jerusalem, his Hebrew and Arabic servants, and his family. He studied Arabic and Hebrew to allow himself to conduct his meetings in these languages, translate religious documents and ceremonies, and to converse with local Jews and Arabs. He would also debate and preach on the streets, handing out tracts or pamphlets to forward his cause. He did baptize one person in Jerusalem, Johanna Elkari, known as Hannah, a Greek Orthodox Christian from Nablus, who had been a servant of the families as a young teenager. He baptized Hannah at about age 15 on May 7th, 1859, in the lower pool of Siloam, much to the consternation of Hannah's family. Hannah followed Jones to London in 1861, went to the Baptist Theology School there, and returned to Nablus to become a well-respected Baptist missionary among his own people. A couple of years after Jones returned to the United States, Hannah wrote to him asking for Miriam's hand in marriage. I have a copy of the letter Miriam wrote back to him, declining the offer. I was happy to find out that Hannah did marry a wonderful British woman, and she was a great support to him in their missionary life in Nablus. Jones's effort in converting Jews, or his inability to convert any Jews, are reflected in these two entries in his journals. August 21st, 1855, to Joseph, his Jewish servant, whom he was trying to convert. Told him I felt in my heart that the Jews never would be happy till they received the Lord Jesus Christ. He treated me civilly. May 14th, 1856, his Arabic teacher in Jerusalem, Sheikh Assad, said that he believes that the Jews are unconvertible. Another reason he had more success in converting fellow Christians was that during this time, Jewish philanthropists such as Sir Moses Montefiore, Judah Turow, and the Rothschilds donated money, and oversaw development of hospitals, schools, farms, and housing projects for the poor Jews of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, so they wouldn't have to depend on Christian charities and institutions for help, and therefore not be influenced by them. I mention Sir Moses Montefiore quite often. He has been described as the most important Jew of the 19th century. After becoming a wealthy man in Britain through insurance and banking, he retired at age 40 to devote his life to improving the lives of Jews all over the world. He had many visits to Jerusalem over the years, twice when Jones was there. In his journal, Jones said, "Sir M arrived, saw many hundreds of Jews who went out to meet him. Saw many Jews coming and going to Sir M, the main attraction now." And about his meeting with Sir Moses, whole Jones family called upon Sir M 3/4 of an hour, talked about roads, Sabbath, and agriculture. Concerning daily life and how they got along. The Joneses and the rest of the American mission would share packages sent from the United States, mostly from their church groups, collecting things they might need for themselves or to give to the poor. In January of the first year in Jaffa, they were surprised at how cold it was, and so from the United States came a package which included a cook stove and fixtures, a parlor stove, a furnace, a lady's saddle, a man's saddle, 6 sheets, a mohair blanket, and more. Besides clothes coming from the United States, Mrs. Jones made clothes for the family and sometimes for their servants and their families, and also for the destitute. Excuse me. Some of their food came from away. At one point, they were waiting for a box of groceries coming from Manchester, England. When the family was sick, a friend sent them a jelly dish, as she had just received gelatin from England. They were gifted fresh peaches from a British friend who sent them from Artis, an international farming colony near Bethlehem. During Purim Jewish festival, they received a present of sweet cakes and meats from the Jew who sells us milk. I have Elizabeth's account book from Jerusalem in 1860 that I showed you earlier. It gives a wonderful picture of what fruit, meat, fish, vegetables, wine is available locally from the markets in different seasons. For example, in March, she bought fish, beets, cauliflower, lemon, coffee, olive oil, etc. By May, she was also to get mishmik, which is an apricot, lime, mulberries, tomatoes, and so on. In September, peaches, rice, dates, pomegranates, quinces were available. Every month, they would buy wood. They would also have a back garden and small animals like rabbits, fowl, and doves. And finally, often on outings, for lunch, they would just pick fruits, such as figs, from the trees. By 1857, Jones was receiving the New York Tribune in the mail. Jones's main purpose in Jerusalem was to spread the word of his religion, but he found that other things kept him busy and was often frustrated that he didn't have the time and energy to do as much as his mission required. There were household chores to do, making a table, a rice box, repairing many house items, cutting and chipping wood, care of the donkey and fowls, working in the garden, repairing bed sheets, ironing paper, grinding and hanging a new scythe, knives, chisel, and axe, making a knife handle, to name a few. He also was very generous with his time to people who needed him. An example was his relationship with 2 foreigners on their own in Jerusalem without family, who were very ill over a long period of time. Both Jones and his wife would bring them food, talk to their doctors, and very often sit and visit. One of the men, Louis Elie Lebet, a young Swiss Sabbatarian, had consumption, or TB, and eventually died. Jones and his wife were friends with him for a few years beforehand and were by his bedside preparing his body and soul for death. After his death, Jones looked after all his affairs, which were many, and took up a lot of time. We have letters from Libette's sister from Lausanne, Switzerland, thanking Jones for all he did for her brother and offering one of the watches that were in Libette's possessions as a gift of appreciation. After research, I found that the Libette family in Lausanne were lace makers and watchmakers. People would also come to him for favors, for translations of business things, and for him to write requests on their behalf. One day, he went to the vice consul, Simeon Murad, on behalf of a woman cook about an assault on her and her brother by an Armenian at the Holy Sepulchre. Warder Cresson, an American Quaker, also known as Boaz Israel ben Abraham, after he converted to Judaism and settled in Jerusalem, and was also called the American Holy Stranger by the Jews, asked Jones to translate for him at the Austrian consul about a situation where an Italian had bitten off part of his little finger. Warder Cresson considered himself the American consul to Jerusalem for many years, though he was unaccredited, which is another interesting story for another time. When Sir Moses Montefiore visited Jerusalem, Jones was asked to write request letters to him. From his journal, I quote, "Wrote 2 letters to Sir M on behalf of poor Jews. One a poor blind human who wishes to go to Vienna to be cured. The other a farmer and proselyte to Judaism, wishes money to help him in farming. He also wrote a letter on behalf of this same proselyte asking for a wedding present, as the day he was marrying a Jewess who had a child." He spent a lot of time as tour guide for English-speaking visitors to Jerusalem. He did not charge them for this, but sometimes sold them some of his photographs of Jerusalem. He also would do portrait photography, and the sales of these added to the family's much-needed accounts. He spent a lot of time studying languages: Arab, Hebrew, Greek, German, and Latin. He also taught English, French, and later on Arabic. He spent time writing his journals, letters, sermons, and regular reports back to the Seventh-day Baptist newspaper in the United States called The Recorder. From the amount of written correspondence saved, letters from as far away as China and the United States, or even short notes delivered by servants asking for an invitation for tea in half an hour from across town, one realizes that without the telephone invention, writing was their only means of communicating, leaving us this wonderful picture of their lives. Every Saturday, he would have a Sabbath meeting at his home for his family, any friends visiting, and others who were interested. On Sundays, they would sometimes go to other Christian churches, especially if the service was in Arabic. And there was his photography. One of his comments in his journal was, "I love to work, but this poor body is frail." He was often sick, sometimes deathly ill. His daughter, Martha Miriam, had a few friends among the foreign families. She was homeschooled by her father and an American tutor until February of 1858, when she started at the new Anglican school for girls at Bishop Gobat's outside the walls. She and her mother also took part in the Arabic and Hebrew lessons. Later in life, back in the United States, Miriam was very excited to have an opportunity to use her Arabic and Hebrew that she had learned in Jerusalem. I have, this was written by Martha Miriam when she was back at school in the United States. She was at the Milton Academy in Wisconsin. She was probably about 16, 17 years old. She wrote this in Arabic and presented the paper in Arabic. It's on the Mosque of Omar. Luckily, she also left us a translation of it. In her small journal, sporadically written in Jerusalem when she was about 15 years old, she has a long description of being invited to and attending on her own a day-long Muslim wedding. It is fascinating to read. And possibly She wore to the wedding one of these outfits. These are two of the outfits that are behind Catherine in the museum. This one is a long coat dress, a green coat dress. This one is pantaloons and a coat dress on top of it. I don't know what she wore, but possibly she wore one of those outfits. In her sketchbook, she drew pictures of people at this wedding and also of people at a family picnic at Mi'kmash, including drawings of the servants. His wife, Elizabeth, ran the household, oversaw the servants, cared for the poor, studied local languages, supported her husband's mission, was a good friend to many, and a mother to their children. She had a child born at their house with a doctor and friend present, little Annie Lizzie, on March 20th, 1857. Her older daughter, Martha Miriam, was 12 years old at the time. The whole family was often ill, especially Annie Lizzie, who died of malaria when she was about 2.5 years old. The description of her death and burial in the journals are heartbreaking. It actually brought tears to my eyes when reading it. They all loved her so. Soon after, Elizabeth, their mother, was ill for close to a year before her death in October of 1860. Many people had malaria symptoms and often died of this, especially within the old walls of Jerusalem where they lived. The air, the mosquitoes, and the water were very bad. In the journals and letters, it's often described as ague, involving fevers, chills, shivering, and excruciating pain. These symptoms were described occurring in passages every 12 hours or so. Often this would go on for months at a time. Also, many times they had inflamed eyes, both children and adults, and this could last a month or two. Other illnesses that would slow them down were headaches, toothaches, cramps, diarrhea, swollen body parts, and so on. They often would treat themselves with homeopathic medicines. After being sick in Jaffa in 1855, Jones mentioned that health restored because of homeopathy. Surprised. Some of these medicines described in his letters and journals were almond water, coffee syrup, brandy and water, arnica, arsenic, aconite, belladonna, ignatia, lobelia, and many more. The missionaries shared the syringes necessary for some of these. When I researched these, I found that many are very potent. One time when Jones was sick, he took some arsenic, but I quote, destroyed its effect by a little wine, unwittingly. When these failed, a doctor was called for from the English hospital in Jerusalem, and they would sometimes be prescribed something to be picked up at the dispensary at the hospital. The doctors made many house calls. Jones was in charge of at least 5 funerals that he recorded, all either described in his journals or, as for his wife's, noted the expenses in their account book. Rebecca Dennis, whose name we saw with Annie Lizzie's and Elizabeth's on the new stone in Jerusalem Protestant Cemetery, was the 8-year-old daughter of friends of theirs, Mendel John Dennis, fellow photography, and his wife, Sophie Keel, who was a friend and neighbor who stayed with Elizabeth during and after the birth of Annie Lizzie. Rebecca died unexpectedly after returning from school in the afternoon. The funeral, as with all in this hot land, took place the next day after the body lying at the home. She was buried at the American Cemetery on Mount Zion, as Annie Lizzie and Elizabeth Jones would be soon after. From Jones's journal, this is the description of what he had to do to prepare for her burial. May 19th, 1859. Preached at the house for 50 people, early morning. Get a man to dig a grave, American Cemetery, Mount Zion. Went to Wise's shop, making a coffin, to Vester's, to John A. Steinbeck's home, woodcarver, carpenter, then to Dennis's, then to cemetery, then to the shop of Wise, then to Vester's, then to John's, then back to Wise's to get the measures of the coffin, then to Dennis's, and arrange for inviting people and order of the funeral. went to the cemetery and had the grave finished and aided them for nearly an hour cleaning a path of thistles and thorns. Returned to Dennis's, then home. Preached at 4 p.m. at graveside. All in tears. Sing hymn. August 24th, 1859, Annie Lizzie's funeral. Jones was very ill and could not go to the cemetery for the burial. They had Mr. Rominger, the undertaker, arrange everything. Mr. Dennis, his friend, stayed at the house with Jones while everyone else went to the cemetery, and Hannah, the young servant who was later baptized, carried the small coffin with the help of Mr. Teal, John Steinbeck's brother-in-law. There were 15 people at the graveside ceremony. Jones was so upset by her death that he did not visit the gravesite until 3 months later. October 11th, 1860, the expenses for Elizabeth's funeral. Paid the American Mission in Beirut 10 Spanish dollars for the gravesite. Also paid the bearers of the coffin, people to dig the grave, to buy 5 stones, a canvases, that's a police guard, pay to have the Jaffa Gate opened, and for a horse. Jones took a photograph of the cemetery after his wife was buried there, the one that I showed you earlier. Jones and his daughter Miriam moved out of their rented house to a hotel after the funeral for the last 2 months of their stay in Jerusalem. The two of them left, making their way back to the United States via London on December 25th, 1860, about 3 months after Elizabeth's death. Now for some interesting events taken from Jones's journal. October 11th, 1857, he and Martha Miriam witnessed a ceremony carrying of the rolls of the law. Last evening, Miriam and self attended the ceremony of carrying around the rolls of the law. It was done 7 times, accompanied with dancing, clapping of hands, and singing or chanting. It was a noisy, gay time. This is a Jewish celebration, Simchat Torah, the holiday that marks the conclusion of the annual cycle of public Torah readings and the beginning of the new cycle. And then on February 1st, 1858, 14 inches of snow. He had a snowball fight with an American friend, reminded him of boyhood. The snow was still there on the 5th when trying to go to the store, Mrs. Jones on the donkey, which was having a hard time getting through snowdrifts from snow thrown off the roofs. Remember from the photographs that I showed you that the roofs are all flat, and so everyone had to shovel this amount of snow off. I wonder what they used for snow shovels. Same month on the 12th. In our evening walk, Miriam and self saw a vast multitude of people outside the city, inquired the cause, and found that a Russian bishop was expected. Thousands were in waiting, Russians, Greeks, and Armenians. Near sundown, the bishop arrived, escorted by 50 horsemen. The road for nearly half a mile was thronged with people. He comes to the gate, kisses the cross, and enters. The Greeks uncover heads and sings. March 23rd, 1859. He noted in his journal that Prince Alfred of England entered the city. Alfred was the 16-year-old second son of Queen Victoria, who at 12 years old joined the Navy. At 15 was appointed midshipman in a ship that served in the Mediterranean. Jones noted on the 23rd, saw Prince Alfred departing the Jordan from the top of my house. May 16th, 1859. Prince Constantine, still in Jerusalem. Provisions are dear on account of the influx of travelers and Russians just at this moment. Prince Constantine, the Grand Duke of Constantine of Russia, was the younger brother of the Emperor Alexander II and was the great-grandfather of the late Prince Philip. Russia sent each year a considerable number of pilgrims to Jerusalem. Russian newspapers at that time announced that the Grand Duke himself will perform this journey. Jones spent a lot of time walking around the city, traveling and exploring the Holy Land. In his journals and sometimes letters, he described many outings with his family, friends, and with English-speaking foreigners visiting the Holy Land. Often in the evening or early morning, probably when the weather was cooler, he would go for a walk, either by himself or with his family. Walk out of Damascus Gate, return Jaffa Gate, saw Pasha and Sweet in distance, then walked top of Zion, sat down seat of stone on terrace made to catch rainwater. He would describe Miriam sometimes picking flowers and bringing them home. One trip with another family was to Bir Ayub, Fountain of Job, for sake of the air, the water, and the pleasure of the thing, he said. And then there were picnic parties at Michmash and En Rogal, a spring on the outskirts of Jerusalem. On one tour with a group of visiting Methodist ministers, he took them to the upper pool, the old wall in the northwest of the city, olive trees, tomb of judges, wailing place, view from his roof, and the Sephardic and Ashkenazi synagogues on Sabbath. Other places in and around the city they went to over the years were the Tyrolean Valley, Accra, the ash heaps, which described in Jones's words were, towards the northwest and not far from the Nablus Road and the tombs of the kings are some considerable heaps of blue-gray ashes in which no grass or weeds ever grow. One is 40 feet in height. Dr. Roth, a well-respected zoologist from Munich, living in Jerusalem and an acquaintance of the Jones family, took samples of the ash mounds back to Germany in 1853 to be tested as to their origins, which were quite disputed, and discovered that they were probably animal ashes from temple sacrifices from centuries ago. This site was cleared in the early 1900s for housing, and so they're no longer there. They also often would go to quarries or caves under the city. When a local man was missing for 3 days, they checked these quarries for him, but did not find him. I don't think that they ever did find this man. They could look at the temple grounds, which could not be visited unless one was a Muslim, from the roof of his house on Accra. They visited Mount Scopus, Anathoth, Pool of Siloam, where converts were often baptized, Mount of Olives, Bethany, Lazarus's tomb, Robinson's Arch, Holy Prison, Field of Blood in Hinnom Valley, Bethlehem, Artis, the Greek convent of St. George, Valley of Jehoshaphat, Garden of Gethsemane, and many more. I have a photograph here. This is written on the back, Olivet and Garden of Gethsemane at the foot of the hill. So I think the garden is within the walls down here. And I also read somewhere that the olive trees within this garden are 1,000 to 2,000 years old. Sometimes Jones would make a trip with everyone on donkeys and horses and go further, for example, En Kerem, which was 2 hours away by donkey, and then home. In our day, I understand that En Kerem is less than a half an hour bus trip to Old Jerusalem through the traffic. Or taking camping gear and go even further. For example, in the summer of 1860, Jones accompanied British traveler to Nablus. His description of starting the trip and delays are amusing. Left at noon, expected to leave at 9 a.m., but our Arab muleteers were not to be hurried. My friend the Englishman was provoked by their laziness, but his indignation seemed to have no effect. Then their memory or their will was sadly at discount. The tea kettle, the coal, the cruse of water are placed in their hands, and we are off. We are advanced half an hour when these have to be sent for, they having set them down and forgotten. Who had not been delayed, who has traveled in the East? Christian and other tourists probably visit many of the same locations in this Bible land today, but not the ash heaps as they no longer exist. And I wonder about the quarries and caves under the cities. And now finally, his work in photography. The first mention of Jones' interest in photography was after the family's 3-month summer visit to Jerusalem while still living in Jaffa in 1855. He received a letter from James Graham, a Scottish missionary who was sent to Jerusalem by the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. He lived in a tower on the Mount of Olives. His letter talks about the pictures he took with Jones and their quality. James Graham is considered a leading 19th century photographer working in Palestine in the 1850s. He taught photography to Mendel John Dennis, another friend of Jones's, who I have mentioned before. From December 2007 to April 2008, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem organized an exhibit of Graham's and Dennis's 1850s photography at the Popper Gallery in Jerusalem. So I think that Graham not only started Dennis in photography, but also my great-great-grandfather. The first mention of taking and developing photographs on his own after moving to Jerusalem was going on a day outing with Mendel John Dennis in September 10, 1856. Spent about a day getting photographic apparatus ready, including paper, etc. Early hour loaded donkey with apparatus on one side and Mr. Dennis's on other. We went to the Mount of Olives, ate ripe figs from the trees, after taking some views home. The equipment would have been the camera, tripod, prepared glass, and probably much more. Developing would have been done later at home, producing an album and print. This method of developing was only invented in 1850. Prepared paper is dried in a darkroom, then placed in a frame under a glass negative taken from the camera and exposed in direct sunlight outside until the image achieves the proper level of darkness, from a few minutes to an hour, depending on light conditions. We have on display at the museum copies of 24 original photographs he took in and around Jerusalem between 1859 and 60, along with descriptions from the printed catalog prepared by Jones of these photographs. From his beginning of photography in 1856 to the end of his journal writing in 1859, he often mentioned his work. For example, December 30th, 1857, at home developed my negatives and found that the exposition had been too long. They were burned. February 25th, 1859, rainy day, busy in photography. April 10th, 1859, darkened window in new house in Accra for photography. December 16th, 1859, occupied in photography, failed and was discouraged in the morning, but had good success in the afternoon, which revived my spirits. A 3-day trip for photography was described in his journal as a very frustrating endeavor. Trip to Hebron, stopped to take photographs, tried to get Brother Barnes in the picture. Cloudy afternoon with only an occasional light of sun. The Arabs gathered around and annoyed me. Camels, donkeys loaded with wood, men, women, children, the 75 donkeys from the grove, had to close the camera about a dozen times. He also mentions that on this trip he had a bad toothache, which might account for his mood and impatience. The cost of living in Jerusalem for foreigners was very high, and the Jones family did not have very much money and were desperate for funds from supporters in the United States that did not always come. He started selling his photographs to visitors, as his friend Mendel John Dennis did for a living. He sold his first photographs December 4th, 1857, to Methodist Americans who were staying at Christian Hauser's hotel, called the Mediterranean Hotel. He had shown them around the city beforehand. From research, I read that photographers at this time worked out deals with hotels to be able to contact guests to sell their photographs. I think Jones had a deal with Mr. Hauser because it often mentioned, such as on November 25th, 1859, went to Hauser's twice on business photography. In his papers, there's a printed card recommending Mr. and Mrs. Ducas's hotel as a good hotel for guests. So maybe he had a deal with them also. He also mentions doing a portrait sitting with Lucy Osborne, a British young lady who worked for the head of the British hospital, Dr. Atkinson's family. In their 1860 account book that I showed you, Elizabeth noted getting paid for portrait sittings. We have a portrait of his wife and daughter he took about 1859 or 60. So this would be the portrait sitting. This is Elizabeth, his wife. She was about 39 years old or 40. This is Martha Miriam. She was about 14, 15 years old at the time. This would have been taken in their house. And as you see, a piece of material in the background as a background. There is a letter from John Mendel Dennis dated June 9th, 1860, offering a list of his photographic equipment for sale as he was moving with his family to the United States. He says he doesn't want to pressure Jones for an answer, but camels were coming to take their things to Jaffa later that day to be put on their ship. I don't know if Jones bought anything. Also, a French letter from Otto von Ostheim dated 1860, probably December, just before Jones was leaving for the United States. He was an Austrian photographer in Jerusalem at the time. His photographs are in the Getty Museum and in the National Gallery of Canada. In the letter, he's apologizing for not having the money as promised to buy Jones's chemicals he was selling before leaving Jerusalem. Jones bought some of equipment and supplies from a wholesale photographic warehouse in London, England, possibly through the local establishment C.F. Spittler and Company. We have a couple of letters from the British Photographic Company concerning things he was buying and recommending new methods of developing. We also have an envelope, small sheets of fine paper inside, separating thin pieces of gold, which is described by Miriam on the first sheet in faded pencil as gold leaf from the bazaar, Jerusalem, and then something I can't read. Gold was sometimes used in some methods of finishing the developed photographs. Possibly that is what this gold was bought for. I have mentioned Mendel John Dennis, good friend and fellow photographer, a few times in this talk. He was a Jew from Odessa who came to Jerusalem as a very young man. He married a Jewess and they had a son. Early on, he converted to Christianity and was baptized first by the British consul James Finn, and later on again by Dr. James Turner Barclay, another American missionary in the Holy Land and author of the book City of the Great King, Jerusalem. This Mendel John Dennis is the same man mentioned in Simon Sebag Montefiore's book, Jerusalem, the Biography. There he is called Mendel Dignus, and Montefiore notes that his conversion caused mayhem among the Jews. I have read that after converting, he was forced to divorce his wife in 1851, leave his occupation as watchmaker, and distance himself from the Jewish community. He remarried and learned photography. He is considered the first Jewish photographer and the first to try to make a living doing photography in Jerusalem. In 1859, he and his family moved to the United States, leaving Jerusalem because too many people were selling their photographs and he was not able to make a living doing this anymore. This is when he offered Jones some of his equipment that I mentioned above. 130 years later, in 1989, a professional photographer from New Jersey visited a garage sale in St. Paul, Minnesota. In a dusty corner of the garage, he found 8 wooden boxes in which were more than 100 glass plates, 4 handwritten notebooks, and some silver prints. On the plates was the name M.J. Dennis. Dennis's great-grandson disposed of these from his elderly mother's attic and said he didn't know that his great-grandfather had been a photographer, and neither did anybody else in the family. Until this time, nobody knew what had happened, what had become to Mendel Dignus, or as Jones knew him, Mendel John Dennis. Today, these glass plate negatives are at the Israel Museum, and the rest of the contents are part of a collection at the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. What an experience for the Joneses, a hard life with many sacrifices. He describes the land around Jerusalem as view of the green tiny barley and wheat, the greens of the fields, and open country very beautiful. But a month later, barrenness and resolution will take its place. That also describes their years in the Holy Land, I think, as his own words reflected after 5 years there. Have been years of toil and sorrow, yet I have had some joy, 5 years in Bible land. 160 years later, we're learning so much about the people and history of Jerusalem from the Jones family's courage, sense of adventure, and commitment to their religion to go to the Holy Land, chronicling their time there and saving it all to pass it on to future generations. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed some of the stories found in this wealth and information from the lives of the Joneses. There are many more stories in these pages, as you saw from the stickies in the journal, but not for today. Thank you very much.
Cassie, wow. Thank you so much for such an interesting and detailed presentation about your great-great-grandfather. As we've heard, the Joneses faced many challenges of living in the Holy Land, and they rose above them with their courage and their resilience. We are fortunate that the journals, the correspondence, and the photographs have survived and have been so well cared for by the family for the past 160 years, and that you've been able to share this story with a wider audience, with the 40 some odd people who are with us today, and hopefully more who will see the recording.